So this is okay for what it is, but it's kind of a disgrace to call it pesto.
Welcome to episode 4 of Recipes Remastered. Today we're looking at the #1 pesto pasta recipe from allrecipes.com, and I have to say, I was a little disappointed that a recipe like this exists as the #1 search result on Google, so let's change that. Today we'll use cooking science and traditional pesto technique to make a version that releases more fresh basil flavor with a better sticking sauce, and I like to think you'll have the world's Italian grandma, the late Marcella Hazan, smiling down on you as you enjoy it. Hey everyone, I'm Ethan, a home cooking nerd who likes to find better ways to cook and share them with all of you. It's summertime in the US, so that means basil is pretty much in full swing, and for me, that means pesto. So today we're going to be covering Marcella Hazan's pesto recipe from her book, The Essentials of Italian Cuisine. Now, this recipe isn't inherently better just because it's traditional or authentic. Instead, the traditional techniques that are used lead to noticeable differences in the final product. To illustrate this, we're going to first cover allrecipes.com, their top recipe on the Google search results. Then we'll talk about the technique changes from the version that I like from Marcella. And then finally, we'll do a side-by-side taste test to compare the differences. Let's hop in. So I have to point out a couple of assumptions I made before going over this recipe. One, this recipe doesn't actually make the pesto sauce itself, so I made a fairly typical recipe using a food processor. And then next, it isn't even specified that the pasta water should be salted, so I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Let's make this. To a running food processor, add a clove of garlic until it's well blitzed and minced up. Then you can add pine nuts and Parmesan and blitz those as well until it grounds into kind of a rough paste. Then a bunch of basil is added, and while the food processor is running, stream in the olive oil until it is smooth and sauce-like. Then just pour the sauce into a bowl, add salt, and taste it, adjust as you see fit. And now let's go over to the all recipes techniques for bringing this together. First, pasta is cooked in a pot of boiling water until it is done and then drained, and then meanwhile you pour some olive oil into a pan over medium-low heat. To that, chopped onion is added, as well as the pesto and a little bit of salt and pepper to taste, and then you let that cook down for about 5 minutes until the onions are soft. To serve it, you add the pesto to the pasta and stir in grated cheese if you would like, and then you can serve. Now, I'm not saying this is inedible or anything, it's alright for what it is, but my lord, when I had them side by side, it's shocking how much better the other version is, and let's learn why it's so much different. Technique adjustment #1 is use a mortar and pestle instead of a food processor. From Essentials of Italian Cuisine, it is noted that the Genoese cooks in Italy insist that if it isn't made in a mortar and pestle, it's technically not pesto. So if you want to be linguistically correct, use a mortar and pestle, but the cooking reason of why you should use a mortar and pestle for pesto is that it increases the flavor. From On Food and Cooking by Harold McGee, he shows a cross-section of a leaf that looks something like this. Then later in the book, he notes that aroma chemicals in herbs like basil can be stockpiled in oil storage cells, in glands, or in channels between the cells. So why is a mortar and pestle better at releasing these aroma compounds? Well, from a Serious Eats article, Kenji Lopez Alt notes that a food processor shears and shreds the ingredients, tearing apart and breaking down vegetables, but not necessarily rupturing all of the cells to release the aromatic compounds. A mortar and pestle, on the other hand, does a great job of actually crushing individual cells, producing vegetables with much better flavor. I think a great way to visualize this is with a blackberry. Imagine each of these little balls, or drupelets as they are called, are a cell in the basil leaf. When I slice the berry up with a sharp knife a bunch of times, the drupelets are sheared and will give up a little bit of juice, but a lot of juice is still left in there. Compare that with a blackberry that has been mashed. The drupelets are completely ruptured, giving up a lot more juice, or in the basil's case, flavor compounds. Now, don't get me wrong, you can still make great pesto in a food processor. There's no denying it's way faster. But if you do have the time, a mortar and pestle will bring that extra flavor you may not have known that has been missing. Next technique, use butter in your pesto. You heard me right. We are using butter along with olive oil in this pesto. Now, I may be naive in saying this, but I think a lot of people think that olive oil is the only fat source used in Italian cooking, when that's just not the case. In fact, I would highly urge you try Marcella Hazan's 3-ingredient tomato sauce. It uses only butter as the fat source, there's no olive oil in sight, and on a scale of simplicity to tasty chart, it's all the way to the top right. That being said, what does butter actually do for our pesto? Well, from the food lab, Kenji notes that butter, unlike olive oil, contains natural emulsifiers that help keep sauce nice and creamy. Also, butter has a slight sweetness that will help round out the bite from the fresh garlic, and I do have to admit that after years of making pesto with only olive oil, I was still a little surprised the first time I saw Marcella's recipe with it, but after making it, I'm never going back. If you want a creamier sauce that sticks better to the pasta and isn't as olive oil forward, use butter too. The next technique may be the most important, and that is do not cook pesto. To help me with this, I turn to a quote from Marcella's book. Pesto is never cooked or heated, and while it may on occasion do good things for vegetable soup, it has just one great role: to be the most seductive of all sauces for pasta. Earlier in the book, she explains that the less basil cooks, the better it is. The reason why is because the flavor compounds of basil are highly volatile, and when they're cooked they are released, meaning they lose their flavor very rapidly. This is why if you're adding basil to a tomato sauce, it should be done right at the end, and it's why pesto should be used raw at room temperature. And this is why I think many Italians may have shrieked in horror when they saw the all recipes version that sauteed the pesto with onions for about 5 minutes, because it completely changes the flavor profile. Alright, one last improvement, and this one doesn't have anything to do with the pesto, but instead with the pasta, and that is use a bronze die cut pasta. We covered this in my Pasta 101 video, but I thought it made sense to mention it again here. So most pasta that you see at the grocery store falls into two categories. One is bronze die cut, and the other is Teflon die cut. So Teflon die cut pasta is extruded faster and leaves a smooth surface. A bronze die cut, on the other hand, is extruded slower and leaves a rough, almost chalky finish. So our pesto sauce will stick much better to the rougher texture of the bronze die cut pasta. So when you're looking at the grocery store, bronze cut or slow dried on the box are typically good indications. Now it is fair to mention that bronze cut pasta is going to be about $1 or so more expensive per pound, but it's an upgrade well worth making because the texture and flavor are vastly superior in my opinion. Alright, let's make some pesto step by step, and then we will do our taste test. To start, set a pot of water on to boil. Once boiled, add a large 4-finger pinch of salt, ideally 10 grams of salt per liter of water, or a 1% solution. Add in the bronze die cut pasta of choice, and cook until al dente. And remember, for this pasta, it's not finished in a sauce over heat, so cook it exactly how you want to eat it. For the pesto, remove the skin from 2 medium garlic cloves and add them to the mortar with a tiny pinch of salt, then just begin bashing the garlic into a rough paste. Next, pour in 20 grams of pine nuts and grind those together into a paste as well. Once those are incorporated, add about 1.5 cups of tightly packed basil leaves. Now, I would have liked about an extra 1/2 cup of these, but I was a little short, so mine turned out a little bit lighter green. But anyway, add the basil with another little pinch of salt. Then, using the pestle with a rotary movement, grind all the ingredients against the side of the mortar. When the basil has been ground into a paste, add 30 grams of grated Parmesan Reggiano and 10 grams of Pecorino Romano cheese and grind those evenly into the mixture. Once those are done, you're going to set the pestle aside and grab a spoon or spatula. Add the 75 grams of olive oil in a very thin stream, beating it into the mixture with the spoon. When all the oil has been incorporated, add 28 grams of butter with the spoon, distributing it evenly. And I would like to note that you can feel free to adjust the ratios of olive oil to butter. If you want it a little bit thicker, just use less olive oil. If you want it more olive oil forward, just use less butter. Just mess around with your ratios and see what you end up liking. To actually serve the pesto with pasta, reserve about 1/2 cup of the pasta water and then transfer the cooked pasta to a large bowl. Spoon the pesto over top the pasta, then add a couple spoonfuls of the starchy pasta water, which is going to help dilute the pesto and help the sauce emulsify. Begin mixing this together until a cohesive sauce is formed that kind of sticks and is glossy to the outside of the pasta. Add it to a bowl, and you can serve with more parm, fresh basil, or diced fresh tomatoes if you would want, but now it is time for our taste test.
All right, everybody, it's time for the taste test. So I have the all recipes one here on the right side, and then I have the Marcella Hazan one over here on my left. And before I actually taste, just looking at them, you can see there's a complete difference. The Marcella Hazan one actually has like that little sauce like that you would expect in aglio e olio or cacio e pepe. It's a little bit glossy on the outside. This one has absolutely none of that, but let's dive in and actually taste test them. All right, let me think how I want to say this. So this is okay for what it is, but it's kind of a disgrace to call it pesto. And what I mean by that is basically it has a completely different flavor profile, and it's not because it was in a food processor, right? You can still make great pesto in a food processor. It's all because the pesto was cooked. It literally gets rid of all those volatile aromatic compounds that basil has in its fresh or very lightly cooked form. I mean, cooking something like basil in the pesto for 5 minutes, it's shocking just how much it actually changes it. I've never actually done a side-by-side taste test like this because I've never actually cooked pesto before. So when I saw it in that recipe, I was a little bit shocked to see that because I was like, I've literally never done that ever. I've always just mixed the pesto right into the cooked pasta. You never actually cook it first before mixing it in. And I totally understand why, because like I said, it's okay, like it's not inedible, but if someone served this to me and I was expecting pesto, I would be very, very disappointed. That being said though, let's talk about all the great things happening in this one. First off, the flavor is absolutely off the charts. The basil it literally tastes like you're eating it off the plant. Because as we know, like this is when basil is its most fragrant, and that totally comes through in this pasta. And then the garlic, it lets you know it's there, but it's not overpowering, which is kind of what you want with pesto. I mean, if you like garlicky pesto, add a bunch of garlic, go ahead. But you kind of just want it to like let us know it's there, not necessarily overpower everything. We want the basil to really shine through in this pasta dish. And then outside of that, from a texture perspective, we got that nice sauce. And again, that's from the creaminess of the butter. That's from using the bronze cut pasta. And it really just creates that really nice emulsion for the sauce, and it sticks better on the pasta. It's absolutely delicious. This is a killer recipe. Definitely make it. I would have actually liked to have more basil than I did. By the time I actually snipped off all that I could take off of that plant without essentially killing it, I would have probably 1.5 times the amount of basil. So that's why this is a little bit on the light side, because the cheese and the butter on those lighter components kind of overpowered it because I didn't have quite enough basil. But it's absolutely delicious as is. You guys need to make this recipe. It's summertime. Go get a bunch of basil, make some pesto, enjoy it. The one thing I have to say is just never cook your pesto. Whether you make it in a food processor or a mortar and pestle, that's fine. Just never cook your pesto. That's gonna wrap it up for this one. I will catch you all in the next one. Thank you for all my Patreon supporters for supporting the channel, helping me grow, and all of you for just joining along in this journey. It's been absolutely wild, the growth of the channel, and I truly do appreciate it. That's gonna wrap it up for me in this one. I will catch you in the next one. Peace.